Welcome, everyone. My name is Bhagwan Chaudhary. I am a professor of finance at the Indian School of Business and a research professor at UCLA Anderson School. It is my privilege and honor to welcome all of you, including our esteemed panelists today, to this joint event series, the World Discussion Series at UCLA Anderson School and the Global ISB Forum. Um, the word global has changed its meaning. When we started the Global ISB Forum, we promised that we will come from different locations. And then we started in Hyderabad and Singapore, and we did an event in Chicago and San Francisco. But today's session, given the COVID, is coming to you from globally, from everywhere. I'm in Hyderabad. We have Arvind Singhal and Secretary Saran, who are in New Delhi. Keshav is in Mumbai, I believe. And Professor Romain Wacziarg is sitting in Los Angeles. So truly a global partnership, truly a global. So we are going to start with Arvind Singhal, who will be the moderator, and he'll give us an overview. And when it comes to relationship between US and India, one could take a short view or a long view, and he will tell us how looking at a long view really helps. Also, we can take a local view and a global view. So local view would be what's happening to politics in India, what happened to elections in Bihar, what happened to elections in the US. But one could take a global view of how the geopolitical situation is going to change over the coming decades. So today's panel is uniquely qualified. We have two successful business people, Keshav and Arvind Singhal. We have Secretary Saran, who has had extensive experience in diplomatic relationships for India, and Professor Wacziarg, who spoke in the Global ISB Forum almost a year ago, who is an expert in international relations and has a special affinity with India. So I will be looking at the questions you will be posing. So you will need to go to slido.com, and if you type in the password 14484, you can post your questions here. I will read out the questions on your behalf, which will happen approximately 45 minutes from now. In the meanwhile, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop speaking and let Arvind take over. My only goal would be to act as audience, which means that if any of my speakers use words that I don't understand, I might interrupt them. For example, if they say postmodern, I will stop them. If they say heterogeneity, I will stop them. If they say endogenous, I will stop them. If they say hegemony, I will stop them. So I will ask them to explain it in simple words that everyone can understand. With that, let me pass it over to Arvind.
Thank you very, very much, Bhagwan. I will make sure personally, at least I do not use any complex words there. It is a very, very good evening to all those joining in North America. A good morning to those who are joining in from India. It is indeed my own privilege and honor to moderate this particular session, which is of special interest to me, not because the fact that I went to US way back in 1980, the very first flight in my life, the very first time I had landed anywhere in the world, which was Los Angeles. And since that, US has shaped me personally in more ways than one. Today's session, I would like us to consider through multiple prisms. So one facet is certainly the geopolitical strategic facet. The second facet is the economic, business, and technological as well, because technology plays such an important role. The third facet is, of course, the social and cultural facet. And while we may not be spending too much time discussing today, but there is a fourth facet which is emerging, which would be, I think, a very important part of the US India relationships in the years to come, which is the ESG, the economic, social sustainability, and good governance facet as well. And I think there will be a lot of convergence there. So I just wanted to, for the benefit of my panelists, say that let's look into the US India relationship through these multiple dimensions, each one of them. I think there is a lot of role to play for both the countries. The other way to look at the relationship is what I've tried to do is to divide it into three time buckets. For India, 1947 is a special year. We got our independence in 1947. So there was a US-India relationship before 1947. From 1947 till about mid-90s, there's another facet, and I'll just elaborate a couple of minutes on that as well. And then when you look into the mid-90s, when the Indian economy started to open up a bit, the end of Cold War as such, so we know there's a third relationship which we are in today. And then when we look into the 2020s, 2030s, and 40s, what the future might look like. If I were to look into before 1947, my belief is that India was almost entirely decoupled from USA at least. There was very limited amount of engagement, barring a visit from Swami Vivekananda to the USA or now and then. But by and large, the society in India and the society in the US probably had very little reasons to interact with each other socially, economically, or even politically. When we go into 1947 till 1990s, unfortunately, I would use the word as an Indian sitting in India, there were more divergences than convergences. That was a period where there was a steady move of people from India, students from India, to go to the US for higher studies. But those numbers were far and few. And many of them who chose to go to the US in 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, they decided to stay back into the US. Politically, and Secretary Saran will certainly talk about that in much more detail, there seem to be more divergences than convergences in terms of the global perspective and view about collaborating with each other. Economically, unfortunately, India chose to become a more insular society, and therefore we were more trying to prevent global businesses to come to India as opposed to encourage them to be in India. There, something very interesting happened, almost unplanned, in the 90s, there, which I think have a very, very strong bearing on the US-India relationship as in today and going forward. In 1991, India embarked upon the path of, as we call it, as the liberalization. Dr. Manmohan Singh, the then finance minister, Mr. Narasimha Rao, then prime minister, India finally shed some of the cloak of insularity it had put upon itself and encouraged businesses and society to sort of start to look into outwardly rather than inwardly. Around the same time, the global Cold War as such, also started to sort of fade away into some distant memory as such. And very interesting thing happened as far as India is concerned, and Keshav may refer to that. India started to see emergence of an economy which was led by information technology outsourcing, which encouraged a very large number of average Indian, if I may use the word average in the broader sense of the word, who had their first chance to interface with the US, sometimes on site in the US. And these people were not the ones who migrated to the US. These were the ones who spent time, months, years at times in the US, came back to India, and therefore there was a dissemination of cultural aspects, which was very, very unique there. So 1990s onwards is a very different phase of the US-India relationship. There was more convergences rather than divergences there in this relationship, politically, socially, economically, and so on and so forth. With this perspective, I would now like to request Secretary Saran, if he can sort of guide us through India pre-1947, India in the 90s, or till then, India today, and more importantly, India tomorrow. Sir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Singhal. And I would like to thank UCLA as well as the Indian School of Business for organizing this very interesting panel discussion, and also for inviting me to share my perspectives with you. You have already, in a sense, explained, the trajectory of India-US relations ever since India became independent. So I think perhaps it may be better for me to really unpack some of the convergences that you are talking about, which really characterizes India-US relations today. I was, of course, associated with building up of these relations as negotiator of the India-US nuclear deal several years ago, and also with the general sort of strengthening of relations between the two countries. So if we are looking at India-US relations, particularly in the context of the political transition that is taking place in the United States. The question, of course, which is asked is, are there going to be continuities in the India-US relations, or are there going to be some major changes? Would the relationship see perhaps a slowing down, some weakening? Or are we going to see even further strengthening of this relationship? So in that context, let me make the point that with regard to the convergence, most important convergence between India and the United States is, of course, the emergence of China. The fact that China has emerged today as the second largest economy in the world. Its footprint across Asia, across the rest of the world, has been increasing, and sometimes increasing quite dramatically. There is no doubt that the kind of asymmetry of power which existed since the end of the Second World War between China and the US, that asymmetry has shrunk, even as the asymmetry between India and China, in a sense, has been expanding. And therefore, there is a concern about what the arrival of this new power with very major and significant economic capabilities, military capabilities, what does it mean in terms of the global order, which has so far been really dominated by the US and the West. And I think in managing that transition to a world which will probably be more multipolar in character, where the US, having been used during a certain period of time to literally setting the rules for the global order, whether it is in the trading regime or in terms of the financial regime, is now finding that it has to work together with other partners in order to but number one, safeguard its own interests, but also to make certain that a rule-based order of the kind that we have seen in the many years past, something like that continues to operate. And in that context, therefore, there is a very strong convergence between India and the United States, because we are both liberal democracies. We are both countries which have a stake in a much more balanced architecture in Asia, a more balanced architecture globally. And working together, we can perhaps contribute more to that than if we were working at cross purposes. And it's not only India and the US. You have seen the emergence of the Indo-Pacific strategy, India working together with Japan, with Australia and the US in order to provide some kind of a more inclusive, a more balanced, a more transparent, rules-based order in this, particularly in the Asian region. So what we have seen is that since the time that the Cold War ended, which Professor Singhal referred to, the kind of disconnect that there was between India and the US, because India was seen being closer to the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, that prism, in a sense, dissipated. Over a period of time, it was replaced by the challenge of a rising China. So in the changed prism, India began to be seen as a very critical partner in managing the transition to a very different kind of order. And this was helped by the fact that India was, of course, a major power in terms of its military capabilities, particularly naval capabilities. It had a big economic potential, but that economic potential had not really, in a sense, manifested itself. But thanks to the economic reform and liberalization that was inaugurated in the early 1990s, India also began to be seen as a great economic and commercial promise, as a country which was destined to emerge as one of the largest economies in the world, and therefore one of the largest markets in the world, a great opportunity for the United States of America. So in that context, what I see, even if there has been a change in the administration in the United States, I believe that those drivers, those strategic drivers of the relationship are not only going to survive, but they are probably going to, in fact, even be strengthened, because China's emergence is continuing. The gap between US and China is further diminishing. Thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic, there is going to be an even greater reshuffling of the power equations in the world. And if I look at the current situation, it is likely that China's ascendancy may slow down, but it will probably continue. Therefore, this particular cementing factor in the India-US relationship will likely continue. So I attach great deal of importance to the fact that we have now concluded the so-called 3 foundational agreements between India and the US, which makes security cooperation that much more easy. I also look at the fact that despite the fact that there's perhaps going to be greater focus on human rights, also on the domestic situation in India, this will not, in fact, derail the very strong cementing factors in the relationship. So, to conclude, I see that India-US relations, even under a new administration, will probably see a strengthening in the years to come rather than any weakening. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Secretary Saran. And I'll come back to you to also elaborate if there are any irritants you see in the relationship going forward, but that's for the panel discussion later on. Keshav, if you would like to give a perspective, you would have seen the business aspect of relationship between India and the technological collaboration or cooperation aspect of India change over these years. If you could share your perspective upon, in the prism of U.S. India relationship, how they have been changing.
Sure, Arvind, thank you very much. So first of all, it's great to hear all those opening comments and to be part of this UCLA Anderson School of Management's discussion, as well as the ISB discussion on a very important topic, I think, not just here, but also at a very important part of world history, if you ask me. So first and foremost, let me start by saying that as 2 of the largest democracies in the world, the US and India have tremendous potential to work together. Both the nations are committed to freedom, democratic principles, equal treatment of all citizens, human rights, and the rule of law. And these 2 countries believe in promoting global security, stability, and economic prosperity through trade, investment, and connectivity. And these are the areas I'll focus on. In fact, if we actually flip the pages back in history, we will see that several American ships actually visited Indian ports in connection with trade as early as the last quarter of the 18th century. That, to me, frankly, is long history. Since India's independence, we have faced differences and constraints that were spoken about just now. The distrust of the Cold Wars, the Indo-Pakistan conflict, our own principle of non-alignment, and the wariness over India's nuclear weapons. Yet, we have always and consistently attempted to overcome these differences through committed efforts to strengthen our economic ties. Simple examples: 9 American universities and the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, actually helped to create the first Indian Institute of Technology at Kanpur. Remember Norman Borlaug's collaboration with Indian scientist Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, which resulted in the Green Revolution, which actually was the fulcrum of India's food self-sufficiency. The MOU on technology transfer in 1985 was again a landmark in our economic partnership between the two countries. The 1991 economic reforms that Arvind also spoke about really opened the doors to international trade and investment and deregulation. And the Indo-US Science and Technology Forum was also set up in 2000. And 2005, the Energy Security Dialogue was started and a new defense framework was signed. So what's the progress that has been made in the last 15 years or so? Today, I think that both India and the US view each other as important strategic partners. US has remained the top trading partner for the second consecutive fiscal in 2019-2020, which is showing that there is increasing economic ties between both these countries. Bilateral trade has now increased by over 400% since 2005, from 37 billion all the way to $149 billion in 2019. And the IT industry, to which I belong to, has played a critical role in promoting trade and investment relations. In the last 6 years alone, total trade between both these nations have increased by more than 50%. We are now seeing better technology as a byproduct of increased trade and technology flows, enhancing the overall productivity of all other sectors as well. I think US exports to India now creates more local jobs. In fact, I must remind you of a 2017 East-West Center report that found that every US state now exports to India, and these exports support more than 260,000 jobs directly and indirectly in the US. US FDI, as we know, is growing and is driven by professional, scientific, technical services, manufacturing, and wholesale trade. India's FDI in the US is also led by professional, scientific, and technical services and depository institutions. And US FDI in India was 46 billion in 2018, and India's FDI into the US was 10 billion. As Secretary Saran mentioned earlier, in 2016, India was recognized as a major defense partner, and the COMCASA that was signed in 2018 now gives India access to advanced communication technology. So lots of collaboration. We've also received significant funding to boost solar energy and lower carbon emissions from the US. Indian IT companies provide vital technology services to enterprises across America, helping them to innovate, compete, and grow. And if you look at IHS Markit's research, they found that IT companies, which are the Indian IT companies, added $57 billion to US GDP via their operations and investments, a figure which is higher than the GDP of 6 US states. The Indian IT industry has employed 175,000 individuals directly in America and has supported an additional 338,000 jobs across the US economy, totaling more than 500,000 jobs in 2019 alone. Majority of these employees in these companies work in high-skilled and high-wage occupational categories. Indian Americans have embraced innovation and entrepreneurship, sitting at the forefront of Silicon Valley's technology revolution and founding an estimated 15% of Silicon Valley startups. They have helped the Pentium, create the Pentium chip, fiber optics, and the famous Bose noise cancellation headphones, among numerous other innovations. I think most importantly, Indian IT has also changed the perception about India in the minds of Americans. So what's the road ahead? I actually believe that the tremendous opportunity there is a tremendous opportunity to build on the economic investments that have been made so far. And specifically, if I have to look at three major areas of collaboration, I will say the first is prioritize bilateral trade and investment. We'll talk about it later. I think the second would be build an economic relationship that creates jobs and opportunities for both nations. And the third, I will say, creating a clean energy future. I think that has huge potential. 6 decades ago, Prime Minister Nehru, when addressing the US Congress, had spoken about all of these things. I believe what he said then still rings true, and the potential for both our countries to make progress from here is very, very high. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keshav, and especially bringing up the three dimensions for future. I think all of them are very relevant, and we'll come back to that, like you said. Romain, let's talk a little bit more about the social and cultural aspect. I can preface it by saying that in 1979, I had received a scholarship when I was just graduating out of what is now called as IIT Roorkee to go to the US. And at that time, and I just got admission at UCLA, and I remember all the books which I had read, all the movies which I had seen. Saturday Night Fever had just been released in India. And my God, what my views were that every Saturday and Sunday in Los Angeles, there would be a Saturday Night Fever kind of a scenario for me. I mean, that's a kind of an impression young Indians, I was young at that time, 21, all of that, had about the US. Obviously, USA is much more than what popularly is seen as there. What has been the social and cultural trajectory of India-US relationships, if you can throw some light on this?
Well, thank you, Arvind. And I also want to thank my co-panelists for joining us. It's a really, really interesting topic and discussion. I look forward to our conversation. So I think that, if you think about the historical roots of the ties between the US and India, you're bound to conclude they're only going to get more tight and closer. Although I do think there are some clouds on the horizon at the same time that we should probably be lucid about and discuss, and particularly in the wake of the COVID crisis. But I want to talk sort of about the fundamentals that imply that India and the US are increasingly being linked by what economists call deep integration. I know that Bhagwan is going to interrupt me, so I'm going to maybe say what it is. So deep integration is integration that goes beyond just having a lot of trade and a lot of FDI, and has to do with a more human-to-human contact, exchanges not just of goods and services and capital, but also of ideas, cultural practices, etc. So that's what I would like to talk about, this deeper aspect of the integration between the two countries. And there are several fundamentals that I think can account for why we have that. The fundamentals, I think, have to do, first of all, with the shared democratic system that several of us have already referred to. And second, one that's often overlooked, but is a big advantage in the bilateral relationship, which is the shared language, at least among the elites of India. The fact that there is, easy communication using English is a very important factor. I think, that facilitates both the exchange of people and of ideas between the two countries. And I would say ideologically, there used to be quite a bit of divergence, as Arvind mentioned, in the pre-reforms era. But now there's increasing agreement about the basics of the economic system. And it's not just India espousing sort of market-based economic systems, but it's also about the US increasingly recognizing some of the limits of that system. And so it's not just convergence stemming from one side, it's really a convergence in the views of what constitutes a rational economic system coming from both sides, really. So I think that, one thing that what's striking way is when you look at public debates, both India and the US are extremely diverse countries in terms not just of the ethnic linguistic makeup, but also in terms of ideas and views of the world. So I've done actually some work trying to quantify how diverse the countries around the world are, and India and the US always rank the highest. So if you ask Indians and if you ask Americans their views about basic social issues, you're going to get much more diversity than you will see in what I would call more conformist societies, where you would tend to only see one point of view. And this diversity is a huge advantage that they have, but it also creates the potential for conflict. And the solution that both countries have homed in to resolve these conflicts are democracy on the one hand, and being decentralized, or federalism on the other hand. Those are two major points of cultural, social convergence between the two countries as well. So those are the basic fundamentals, but then the manifestations have to do with increasing links between the two. So I was looking up the numbers. There's 4 million people of Indian origin in the US, namely first or second generation Indians. So it's a huge diaspora for the US and growing, of course. And it's a source of benefits for both the US and India. I think for India, in terms of return migration, there's a lot of work that's been done on how the Indian diaspora of engineers in the Silicon Valley was one of the big sources of comparative advantage for India in the computer industry, because the links that created and the fact that several, many of them returned to India created the conditions for the emergence, or facilitated the emergence of the technology sector in India. So it's really a mutual benefit. The US benefits from the presence of Indian talent, and India benefits from the return of the ideas, the technologies, and the entrepreneurship that comes from the Indian diaspora at the same time. I think if you look at the leadership of both political and business in the US right now, you'll see lots of Indians in or people that were, descended from Indians that are, major figures. So the two main contenders, I think, for the next presidential election, and I realize we just came out of this one and it was very divisive, but we have to think about the next one, which is 2024. You have on the one hand Kamala Harris, who is, of course, whose mother was from Tamil Nadu, and Nikki Haley, who is of Punjabi origin, I believe. And these are leading the rosters in terms of who the candidates might be. We might very well see two people of Indian origins at loggerheads in the next presidential election in the US, especially if Donald Trump decides not to run again, which of course he could, because having lost this one, he still gets one more term. And then if you look at the heads of major US corporations, Google, Microsoft, IBM, Micron, MasterCard, Adobe, there's a long list of companies, mostly in the tech sector, but not only, of current CEOs that are Indian or of Indian origin. We have, in my own sector of activity, which is education or higher education, there are 202,000 Indian students enrolled in US institutions as of 2019. And looking at it from a US perspective, it's an $8 billion export industry just to India. Many of you on the call, I can see through the names on the list of participants, will relate to what I'm saying. And I think increasingly the exchanges go two ways. So we make it a point at Anderson to visit India as frequently as possible, because it's not just Indian students interested in the US economy, it's the reverse as well. So I think, we could talk about many other aspects of the cultural affinities. I really enjoy watching the old videos that were made in 1959 You can find them on YouTube of Martin Luther King visiting India and paying his respects to Mahatma Gandhi, at several memorials. And you can also talk about various polls that people talk about. So India, according to Gallup, is one of the most popular countries among Americans. It's the 6th favorite nation of Americans after Canada, the UK, which I would argue are not really that separate from the US, but of course that's a controversial statement. France, Germany, and Japan. And India is ahead of Israel and Mexico in terms of being a favorite country of Americans. We could talk about the number of shows that are now featured on Netflix that I watch because it reminds me of my long history of association with India. We could talk about the commonalities between Hollywood and Bollywood, only one letter difference there, and all the rest. But there's a lot of points of cultural and social exchange in the relationship that I hope we'll have a chance to discuss more. I'll stop here and maybe we'll talk about some of the clouds on the horizon having to do with the growing populism and the retrenchment from globalization that has accompanied it in several countries, including the U.S. and India, when we have the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Romain. I know that you have an incredibly deep relationship with India. I wish we had some more time to talk about some of those facets as well. For those in the audience who may not know, I have to mention that but Romain's father has been a legend in India. Amongst multiple things he has done, the very famous restoration of many of the hotels, Nimrana properties, they all owe a huge amount of gratitude to Romain's father there. But that's for another time. I have two questions for my panelists.
Arvind,
the first question is what? Sorry, Bhagwan, you said something?
No, I was just going to, as you go to the panel, I know that we are going to go to questions later, but several people have asked the same question, so I'll just pose it as it might come in the panel. Dhanendra Kumar, who's the former Secretary of Government of India, and several other people who did not put their names in, have talked about this fact that just yesterday, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership between 14 countries, including China, was signed as a free trade agreement. And notably, both the United States and India were not part of it. So the question that I'm sure Arvind will ask is this protectionism, Atmanirbhar for India, and Trumpism? Even though Trump is gone, Trumpism is here to stay. Is it protectionism for local interests, or is it really an anti-China stance that both countries do not want China to have a major role in geopolitical situation? And a couple of other people, Akhilesh and Dorothy and Sean Bhatani, have asked a related question, which is, will this anti-China sentiment, if it is really there, help the supply chain and manufacturing in India? So I just wanted to leave that as a thought. Please go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
Perfectly fine, Bhagwan. So I just, let me first talk about two generic questions for my panelists, and then a request to Secretary Saran to specifically comment upon RCEP and the implications of that for India as of now, not being a member of it. The two questions which I have for my panelists is that firstly, like we have seen the rosy aspect of the relationship between the US and India. What are some of the prickly issues which exist today and which might emerge even tomorrow? And a related question, therefore, is keeping in view the positives and keeping in view some of the irritants. What is the road ahead politically, economically, culturally for the two nations there? So first, Secretary Saran, if you can address which are the irritants and what are the possibilities going ahead?
Thank you very much. From my perspective, the simple answer to your question is there is far stronger security convergence and convergence in terms of as I mentioned, the kind of geopolitical situation that we are confronted with, or for example, a common view about the danger from, say, international terrorism. That is something which has really brought India and the US very much closer together. So I see that there is a strong convergence, and which convergence is likely to continue, as I said, even under a new administration. The weak point, despite the potential that exists in the commercial and economic relationship between the two countries, it is in that area where there are irritants. For example, there is always a concern in India that the visa regime in the United States will get further restricted towards Indians. There is also the issue of the United States of America wanting perhaps India to do market opening much more rapidly than India is comfortable with. There have been irritants with regard to the entry of various kinds of US goods into India. You have heard the famous problem with the Harley Davidson motorcycles, or almonds being sold in India from California. So there are those kind of irritants in the economic and trade relationship. We have not been able to find, despite the very close political relationship, we have somehow not been able to find a manner of a way of addressing some of these economic irritants. And to this is added, in fact, very diametrically sometimes opposite positions which India and the US take, for example, in multilateral trade negotiations, where India is actually seen almost like an adversary when it comes to the rules regarding, for example, intellectual property, or the role of public sector enterprises, or the protection given to agriculture, which in India is a very sensitive issue. On all these, there is constant pressure from the United States. And the ability of India, given its own domestic politics, to be able to respond to this is somewhat limited. So I see this tension, in fact, continuing in the future. I would caution people who say, oh, India has walked out of the RCEP, but maybe there can be an India-US, free trade agreement, or in India-EU free trade agreement. RCEP was actually a very low quality trading arrangement, say compared to the TTP, which covered a whole series of areas like intellectual property or procurement policies. So to think that, having walked out of what is perhaps an easier trading agreement to handle, to expect that we would have an easier time negotiating a free trade agreement with the US or with the EU, I think that is a bit optimistic from my point of view. And I would like to, of course, address the RCEP issue, if I may, very briefly, because I believe that India has perhaps not made the right decision in walking out of the RCEP. I can understand that there is a issue about the competition from China. But even when we have not been in any kind of regional arrangement with China, China has been able to sell a lot of goods to India. Why? Because it is competitive, and that is the reality that we need to address. What we have not realized is that RCEP, if we are out of it, yes, we have somehow restricted the access of these countries to the Indian market, but what about India's access to those markets? This is still the most dynamic, economic region of the world, the fastest growing economic region of the world. So, if there is RCEP amongst the second largest economy in the world, the third largest economy in the world, and the Southeast Asian countries, which are also dynamic economies, then what about your entry to those markets? Because obviously, if you are outside the tent, there will be an advantage in terms of the economic and commercial relations of the countries which are part of that arrangement. So I don't think we have looked upon this aspect that, it's not only a question of, somehow limiting imports, but there is also a question of what about, promoting your exports. And if we are talking about supply chains, then supply chains, in fact, cannot work if you have a high tariff regime. Because the whole purpose of these global supply chains is precisely that there should be, very, very efficient delivery of components. Those components should be available at the cheapest prices possible. So if you're going to run a higher tariff regime, then how do you reconcile this with your desire to become part and parcel of global supply chains? So this is something that we should understand. And for me, geopolitically, if India decides to move to the margins of the regional economy, if India decides to move to the margins of the global economy, it is going to be that much more difficult to play a more expansive regional role, a more expansive global role. That is just the reality. The economic pillar is as important as the security pillar. So my own view is that perhaps it was not a wise decision to stay out of the RCEP.
Thank you very much, Secretary Saran. Unfortunately, I tend to fully agree with you. When I say unfortunately, and the reason I say so unfortunately is that, I run a consulting business. I have seen India miss bus after bus, trucks after trucks, ships after ships since 1980s. On this belief about being protectionist of the domestic audience, rather than realizing that we have a much bigger audience outside as well. And therefore, India can gain on the whole much more, being a part of a larger economic ecosystem, rather than trying to live in the splendid isolation and feel good about it. So to me, RCEP again has been one such more missed opportunity, but hopefully the people behind this decision would have thought it better, I suppose, and we'll see how it works out. Keshav and Romain, the same two questions to you. What do you foresee as irritants at this point in time? And what needs to be done or can be done in the years ahead to strengthen both the economic and technological relationship between the two countries, as well as a social and cultural engagement? Keshav, to you first.
Yes. So without repeating what Secretary Saran mentioned, in fact, I think we are all in violent agreement with his statements. But I must say that, for some of in terms of the short term at least, we have seen that while Prime Minister Modi and President Trump seem to have a great personal bonding and relationship, the reality from an economic reality point of view, there have been a number of negative steps taken, which I think need to be corrected right away. And the first thing I will say is, President-elect Biden, very recently said that if he came into power, he will create something like a most favored nation status to India. So I think we need to quickly build on that. The first I would say is serious discussions around the tariff part, which Secretary Saran also referred to. We need to somehow resolve that. I think we have to somehow focus on reinstating the GSP, or the generalized system of preferences that were impacted in 2019. We need to give comfort around IP protection, as well as allegiance and alliance with cybersecurity laws. We should find some way of fast forwarding or fast tracking the trans-Pacific kind of a partnership discussion. Again, some of this may not be priorities for the US right away, but for us, it's important to get ahead. The protectionist areas that Secretary Saran spoke about also, we need to have a middle ground for some of those things, particularly on the data side and things like that. And personally, I think this whole H-1B issue is a very important issue, and I think India must present its case very well, and the US must understand over a period of time that H-1B is not about immigration, it is about the availability of the right talent, right? And whereas the US at this point in time has a requirement of 600,000 people as per IHS market survey, of which 70% of them need a technology background, and the entire H-1B world is only 85,000 visas. So why are we making such a big issue of it, and why is it that this visa category is being used politically as opposed from a business point of view? Finally, I'll end by saying there are many areas of collaboration, particularly around the skilling areas. I think India has done quite a bit of work on the technology skills areas. Through NASSCOM, we built the Future Skills program, and the government of India also has got invested in that. I think the ability for us to take some of that curriculum and actually take that to the US and create platforms where people in the US also can enhance their knowledge in certain areas of technology where India is investing much more, and creating a much more broad-based ecosystem is an area I would start with. The second I would say is we must start getting many, many more US students into India to do programs at companies. It's a very important thing. In fact, I spoke about this to Secretary Ross when I met with him the last time. I think we were all very excited about it, but there has not been enough follow-up action. I think that is something that should be done when students come in and enjoy the entire ecosystem of India and the experiences of India. I think the ability for our two nations to get closer will be much higher.
Very interesting point, Keshav. I fully agree with you. Again, I go back to the time when I was in the US in 1980. Many times people ask that, what did you learn from there? I said, I can't even begin to describe. I got a degree, of course, which is very valuable, but I learned so much more by being in that society itself. And it had incredible influence on the way I grew up later on in my life. So vice versa, if we encourage young American students or even young American professionals to come to India, spend some time here, I think it'll go a very long way in having a better understanding at the people-to-people level. Romain, your two comments on
so I'm not sure
and possibilities.
I'm not sure there's all that much more for me to say after what was said, because I completely agree that the economic and particularly the trade relationship is where there's going to be the most friction. And that's not just with India, it's with the, it's a more generalized worldwide phenomenon. I think that people are becoming much more keen to defend a sort of mercantilistic point of view in trade relations. And that has affected the U.S.-India relationship. Now, I think there's two factors that moderate that. One is what I would call a substitution effect. Bhagwan is going to stop me because substitution has more than 3 syllables, but I don't know. Maybe he's not. Which is that the growing tension with China is going to benefit the trade relationship with India. Not just India, but other players also in Asia, in South Asia and Southeast Asia. Because there's going to be, if the tensions continue and they manifest themselves in increasing levels of protectionism, which is now the subject of a bipartisan consensus in Washington, the sort of crackdown on China, then there's going to be a need to find substitute sources for the products. And so that may help. And the other big factor is Joe Biden's victory, which I think will remove, at least on the US side, a lot of the protectionist rhetoric, if not the actions, at least the rhetoric that you've seen. And I think those two factors will help, but I think they will help, but they will not solve the problem. I think we're likely to see more, frictions. And then we haven't really discussed what happens on the FDI side, but India and China have followed very different strategies with respect to the presence of U.S. brands on their markets. So U.S. brands have had a lot of trouble, especially in the tech sector, being present in China. What China has done instead is to replicate them by creating local brands that basically perform the same tasks, social media, e-commerce with Alibaba, et cetera. Whereas India has welcomed U.S. firms, and I think that's coming under increasing, criticism in India. Why don't we have, why doesn't India have its own equivalents to Amazon, Google, et cetera? We'll see how that plays out. But there, I've seen a lot of, a little bit of pushback, a little bit of nationalistic pushback on those aspects, and that would be problematic, I think, if it took hold more broadly. But for the rest, I completely agree. I think strategically, in part again because of China and the relationship with China, the two countries are only going to get closer. If you read the long history of strategic relations and between the two, starting with the end of the Cold War, it's been nothing but closer and closer. I mean, India was the first country to obtain, an exception to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to that rule that you couldn't trade in civilian nuclear, technologies and products if you were not also part of the NPT. Probably Secretary Saran knows a lot more about this than I do, and ever since then, there's been closer and closer links on that front, and I don't see that going away, especially now that Russia and China are getting closer to each other. The Russia-India relationship was historically based during the Cold War, and that's sort of receding. So I really think it's on the economic front, in the era of populism and protectionism, that we're going to see the most friction. Hopefully, it'll be manageable. I also think GST.
Thank you very much,
by the way, Keshav, I think GST is not coming back. I think GST was a system that was put in place during GATT to help really poor countries gain access to markets in the West. And India's just not really poor. India's a middle-income country and growing extremely fast. And I don't think that's going to come back. I think our best hope for better market access will be a generalization of multilateral arrangements. And hopefully under Biden, this will come back. We've seen this stalled since in the past 20 years, really. Multilateral trade negotiations have been stalled. And I like to say, if something's been stalled for 20 years, it's time for it to restart. So maybe that'll be an instance of a surprise we'll have, that people will realize it's better to deal with conflicts on a multilateral basis.
Thank you very much, Romain. So, Bhagwan,
so
you have the questions.
Let me push everybody on this point. I think, unfortunately, we have collected people who all seem to be globalists, who all seem to agree that free trade is good. And Secretary Saran very cogently put it, how important it is for us to be part of that system. But the political reality is something that we cannot ignore. So I am beginning to feel that those of us who live in the cities, and especially on the two West Coasts in the United States, we don't really understand how people in rural US think. The forces of protectionism are very, very strong. And the two elections, 2016 and 2020, were indeed very close. 50% of the population thinks that we need to be local. And I see that trend in India as well. The Atmanirbhar people get very motivated, they get very excited, especially because it's a stance against China. So again, political and the economics are colliding. Can we really ignore this? Do you think this is just a temporary irritant, or has the world really changed? Do we need to pay more attention to what Romain called populism? Anybody who wants to say a little bit more on that? Yes.
I agree. I agree completely with you. We need to pay a lot of attention to it. I do think that we're going to live to regret the days in which we had more harmonious trade relations that were mediated by multilateral organizations, because I am indeed a free trader, and I think that we will see the costs of protectionism. We've already seen them in many industries in the U.S. in which the Trump administration imposed tariffs. They've actually hurt the U.S. side, and you've seen some people push back against that. The US has a very good conduit between interest groups and policy, and so we've seen it. It's more transparent perhaps than it is in the European Union or other places where there's less of a clear lobbying conduit with reporting, etc. But we've seen that backlash against the backlash, and I think we will. I don't think that the fundamentals. I tell this to my students in my global trends class. The fundamentals that have led to globalization are not going away. The increasing communication, the ease of transportation, the increasing exchanges of people, the fact that we're all connected through the internet, all of those things are here to stay, and politicians are fighting an old war. And the protectionists in the rural areas, etc., are slowing down a trend that I think is irrevocable. But it's concerning that they are slowing it down to a degree that lowers growth rates and hurts lots of categories of the population.
In fact, if I may add, I think those are very valid comments. But if you look at India, I mean, India is a country of so many contrasts. Look at the politics of India itself. To a very great extent, you have regional parties now for years who are actually the kingmakers, right? And therefore, the ability for some of the major political parties manage under the radar, continue to make progress on the economic agenda is very, very high. I just want to point out very recently with COVID and the impact of COVID on the tech business itself. Look, when COVID hit the world, we as a technology group of people had no choice but to keep the lights on for all our clients across the globe, right? Because you have BCP planning, but you never have a PCP or a pandemic continuity planning, which hits everyone at the same time across the globe. In spite of that, India performed admirably. In 1 week, we had desktops, machines. In fact, I was chairman of NASSCOM at that time. 4.5 million desktops were moved to people's homes in a week, right? We got relaxations from the government overnight. We had global businesses continuing to, hum as well as they were before. And now what we are doing is we have now got the government to change legislation such that work from home can actually become permanent and long-term. Now, this will take the business into tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 locations. It will create more part-time employment. It will enable the 100 million women in India who have a secondary education degree but who are not part of any workforce to get involved. But who is going to deliver all this technology? A lot of it is American companies. It will be the Ciscos. It will be the Intels. It will be all of these people who will, now help to take this technology into the interiors of this country. So I think on the one hand, you can position pluralism to some extent. You can position it all done. And if you look at it, even President-elect Biden, he said, make in all America. He used different terms, right? And therefore, the ability for us to collaborate is still very high. So yeah, I think all of this can happen. But I still think we have to get together and do much more.
Thank you. Bhagwan, are we having any other comments or questions?
There is one more.
May I add a comment if it is okay?
Yeah, please do so.
Yeah. So just to point out that, yes, of course, there is almost a global trend against, globalization. And as in India, Prime Minister has said, going vocal for local or, the Atmanirbhar strategy itself. My point is that, I would hope that in India, at least, Atmanirbhar Bharat leads to a globally competitive Indian economy. Not that it opens the door for us to retreat to the pre-1990s of a very high-cost, low-quality economy. I think that is a very fundamental, sort of consideration that we must keep in mind. Secondly, what will make Atmanirbhar Bharat work, if this is the objective, is to resolve really some long-standing structural issues that we have had. You cannot, in fact, run an efficient economy unless you have state-of-the-art infrastructure. I mean, why is China so much more competitive than other countries are? Because over a period of time, it invested very, very heavily in what is really probably the best infrastructure anywhere in the world. I mean, even US infrastructure is, sort of creaky and needs a major overhaul. But infrastructure is absolutely critical. Secondly, what is the regulatory regime? Because if we are talking about, for example, inviting greater foreign investment into India, the question I often gets asked by foreign CEOs is if India is such an attractive opportunity, why are Indian companies not investing in India? So I think we have to create an ecosystem which is as attractive to Indian investors as it is to foreign investors. Yes, there are niche areas where we are doing very well. IT is certainly an area where we see a great deal of dynamism. But the bottom line is globalization is here to stay. May have been slowed down somewhat as a result of this political backlash. But globalization is not going away, because globalization is a creature of technological advancement. As long as technology keeps advancing, globalization will continue to advance. And what we are doing just now is really an example of that. In terms of the digital economy, there is galloping globalization taking place thanks to the COVID-19. So I think these realities, whatever may be the sentiment at the grassroots level or in rural America or in countries like India, I think that reality needs to be understood. And the countries which are going to be ahead of the globalization curve are going to be the winners of the future. Thank you.
Okay. Point very well made. Bhagwan, any other comments or questions you have?
Yeah. So there is one more question, which is a little bit different.
Yeah.
The question is, what is going to happen with the anti-big tech stance in the United States against the 4 or 5 big tech firms? And even in India, there is a sentiment against the big tech US firms, but the reasons here are different because we prefer our own big tech firms like Reliance or Jio. Any thoughts about what the Biden-Harris administration, how they might look at this stance and what implications it will have for India?
Romain, you want to give it a first pass as far as US is concerned?
I think nothing will happen. There's now an antitrust lawsuit against Google, which will follow the same path as the antitrust lawsuit we had in the early 2000s against Microsoft, which is they'll make a lot of noise in courtrooms, et cetera, and then do nothing at the end, or maybe sign some sort of consent agreement that will be toothless and have no effect. I think I don't expect that there will be a breakup of Google or a big crackdown on the tech industry. I think what's more likely is that, in 10 years, probably Google won't be what it is, just in the same way that now Microsoft is not the same. Microsoft is going the way of IBM. It'll be around. It's an important firm, but it's not, Microsoft was the big bad monopolist 20 years ago. And now Microsoft's just a provider of software. Google will just be the same. Some other company will replace it. Facebook, Google, perhaps even Amazon. Amazon, maybe if I have to pick my monopolist, that's the most likely to remain, because there's a brick and mortar aspect to it that's hard to replicate, that doesn't exist with Google and Facebook. But I think that these actions typically are kind of don't have much of an effect.
So let me mention this question was raised by Dhanendra Kumar, who was the ex-chairman of the Chamber of Commerce of India. any effect on the anti-big tech stance in India? We don't want the Googles, we don't want the Amazons of the world because we have our own homegrown geo.
And let me try
Keshav, you want to
and
take this up?
I'll try and address it. So, personally, I don't think there is an anti-big tech lobby. I don't think it is that. I think it is more a nation like India that is evolving, that has, through technology, enabled some of the big names that you spoke about, right? Created huge market impacts, created huge market capitalizations, created huge surpluses in the US, and therefore there is a discussion around why can't a similar move be created using the same people and similar assets also in India. I don't think it is one to replace the other. The sentiment is more a country that is trying to catch up, saying, okay, all these years you did what you had to do because previous governments were more focused on exporting people and talent. And today we are saying that we have created across India in many states these wonderful centers of excellence in each one of these areas, e-commerce included, AI, ML, things like that. Why can't we now create some of these kind of digital assets or great companies in India? That's one. The second also is around, why can't we be a little more self-sufficient in terms of creating capital pools inside India? Look, the whole Flipkart experience was very negative for many people, because when Flipkart got sold for 17 or 20 billion dollars, the discovery a few months later was hardly anything remained in India. All the money went out, right? And therefore, again, it is not against investments coming from outside. It is this whole thing of why can't we create capital pools within India as well, so that those surpluses can be driven inside India and then directed outside. So I would look at it more from a positive, healthy point of view, rather than trying to keep the big guys out, because the reality is the big.
Keshav, I may just want to add a point here, especially because you mentioned about Flipkart. I think in some ways, the way we have structured some of our policies in India, and the point was made a short while ago in any case, we actually discourage investments to take place in India in a very transparent, legitimate manner. FDI in e-commerce or retail is just one such examples. And people have to find very convoluted ways to make investments. And because they are convoluted to start with, therefore, obviously, when the transaction does take place, it also doesn't take place on the soil of the country, so that you don't come afoul of the local laws there. So maybe the way forward in any case is when we look into whether it is American tech giants or American other giants, not only just in tech domain, or Indian companies, I think a simple transparency and fairness about investing itself would go a long way in actually trying to sort of having these recriminations that, but the wealth was created in India, but the opportunity went somewhere else, blah, blah, blah. There. Bhagwan, any other comment or a question before I put some closing comments to my panelists?
Yeah, so there were 2 or 3 comments. I'll put them together. A few people want to know what is the best source or resources to keep abreast of this set of India-US trade relations. Are there any organizations or are there any resources in terms of reading that people can follow, which give a balanced perspective rather than a colored perspective? And a related question about education, I'll put it together, is are there any differences in the way technology and computer science is taught in the US versus how it is taught in India?
Okay, 2 very different kind of questions there.
But both questions related to resources,
Yeah.
People are wanting to know how to keep. So anybody wants to take a crack at it, and then I'll hand it back to you.
So on the broader aspect of the India-US relationship, the Council on Foreign Relations has a very good website where they have a timeline of the relationship, both on the economic and strategic fronts, with links to very good articles. And I find it quite balanced. It's a very mainstream organization. And then for a balanced view, also, I would turn to multilateral organizations like the World Bank or WTO. They have reports on countries, not so much on the links between the countries, but on the countries themselves. So there'll be a WTO report on India's trade policy, for example, that will deal with a lot of the themes that we discussed. On the way computer science is taught, I don't know the answer. Maybe Keshav, you know better.
Well, I can attempt that again. I think the US IBC also puts out some interesting information now and then, and probably that could be a good source of information as well. On I think the way tech is taught, personally, I think it's cheese and chalk. I think based on the investments that both countries make, and based on the fact that India has to use the coat according to the cloth, so to speak, based on the money that we actually have, our focus is completely on scaling, right? And trying to do things differently. Now, within the company, there are very good skilling, upskilling, and technology skilling kind of programs where quite often people coming in from universities are retaught, the basics of a lot of things. That is starting to change now, particularly because we're seeing technology change so quickly that what we have done at a NASSCOM level with the help of the government of India is to actually create a platform now and we have to create very significant assets. So these are platforms across some of the new generation technology like AI, ML, cognitive sciences, stuff like that, where the current 4.5 million Indian people working in technology can actually go and upgrade their skills. And then companies will differentiate again. That's my high-level answer, if it's worth anything to you.
Thank you very much, Keshav. So let's say we're coming almost to the close of the session today. So if I can request all my panelists to just very quickly, in one paragraph, what do they think is the future of U.S.-India relationship, beyond saying it's very good, but a little bit more color to that. We'll start by Secretary Saran, and then of Keshav, and then Romain.
Thank you very much. As I pointed out that, there will be a strong convergence of strategic interests between the two countries, which is likely to persist even with a change in administration. However, I would like to make two comments. One is that the domestic situation in India might become an issue with respect to the new administration, not perhaps so much with the new administration as it may be with the US Congress. And one of the great success stories of India over the last 20 years has been that even though there has been a considerable political polarization in the US, India has been unique in enjoying a bipartisan consensus as far as the US Congress is concerned. We have managed to actually get a tremendous amount of political support for the strengthening of India-US relations from the US Congress, despite the division between Democratic and Republican. That has diminished. We have to acknowledge that. We have had some comments from US congressmen, even during the election campaign. There has been some comment about situation in Kashmir or the communal situation in India. Now, if that acquires a greater salience in how the relationship is taken forward, then that will be another sort of vulnerability that we will need to address. I would hope that it doesn't come to that, but that is something that we have to keep in mind. The second is that with so much of focus on China, as I've said, one of the important cementing factors in the relationship, is there likely to be a different trajectory in US-China relations? I think all of us have assumed that there will be structurally a continuance of the political, strategic, and economic confrontation between US and China. But one should be open to the possibility that there could also be a move on both sides to try and moderate some of that confrontation, to try and find some kind of a modus vivendi. After all, even during the Cold War, despite the fact that the US and the Soviet Union were completely, in ideological confrontation and military confrontation, they were able to find some kind of a compromise on important issues. And I don't think we should exclude that there could be that kind of a not a sort of a blossoming of very positive relations between the two countries, but moderating some of the confrontational, sort of relationship that we see right now. And what implications would that have, therefore, for India, which is looking at China as its main sort of adversary and challenge. So we have to keep perhaps these aspects in mind as we take the relationship forward. This will need a lot of intensive engagement and dialogue between the two countries so that misunderstandings and misperceptions do not arise. Thank you.
Thank you very much for making these two very important points, sir. Keshav, your closing comment, and then Romain.
Sure. So, Arvind, first I will say that I don't think that China alone should now be the basis of these two nations aligning for the long term, right? It is a borderless world. I run a company that has operations in 16 countries, and I can tell you protectionism is now here to stay. And we see it in almost every one of our countries. In spite of that, in every country, we do a great job. You look at the Indian startup ecosystem, in spite of all that we discussed, you will see that the bulk of shareholding of some of the new smart startups is Chinese, even today, right? So I will say that first and foremost, we must be very pragmatic about the fact that we have to build a relationship based on trust, mutual trust, transparency, and finding ways and means of building a great momentum together. I actually think prioritizing bilateral trade and investments is something that must be focused on. I think building economic relationships which are win-win for both sides and creates jobs in both sides is important. Remember, I mentioned this thing about students. I'm extremely serious about it. A very good structured program has to be done in order to bring American students into India. It can't be just Indian students going in. And finally, one area that we missed in this discussion, which I think has the greatest potential to bring our two nations together, is around the energy sector, right? And let's face it, technology and India's prowess in technology will continue to be built upon and will continue to be a big differentiator and will continue to be something that will bring America and India close. I'm very confident about that as well.
Thank you very much. Romain?
Well, I share Keshav's optimism about the relationship. I think it's based on deep structural factors that will only lead to closer relationships. I agree that there are aspects that will require a lot of work and coordination on the trade front, on the FDI front, probably on the technology transfer front as well. But these are manageable issues that we have lots of experience with. And I think what I was referring to as deep integration will only continue and progress. And at least it's my hope, but it's also I think a reasonable expectation to have. But I also want to thank the co-panelists for joining us. And this is a
well. Before I conclude and pass it on to Bhagwan, I also want to thank ISB and UCLA Anderson, my alma mater, and also sincere thanks to Secretary Saran, Keshav, and to you, Romain, for giving me this opportunity to be a part of such an interesting discussion today. Hopefully, we'll have many more such interactions and engagements. Over to you, Bhagwan, for the closing.
Thank you, everyone. One of the questions that I did not get a chance to, but I'll close with that, not a question, but a statement, is reaffirming that globalization is here to stay. And even when we look at climate change, I want to remind everyone that solar energy has become so common and popular now only happened after China was able to produce these solar panels at scale at a very low cost, very low cost. So we are all in it together. Nobody is an island. I want to thank everyone. Usually, we end the Global ISB Forum TGIF with a cup of tea. So, I invite all of you to have a cup of coffee or tea in your own home. So, thank you all for joining. Thank you for the panelists and Erwin for a great session.